Hey guys, what's going on? Happy Thursday, February 8th, 2024. Welcome to Facebook Live. A lot of stuff going on in my head that I want to kind of dump out here, guys. So bear with me. There's like three major things, if I even remember what those three things are. Let me start off with the Jerome Powell 60 Minutes interview. And we go through these. Go through them fairly quickly, and then maybe if there's some time, I'll circle back to some. But all three of these things I'm going to cover in more depth at some point or another. So Jerome Powell interview, lots to say about that. I think this was this past Sunday that he was on 60 Minutes. Maybe it was the Sunday before that. But he was interviewed by Scott Pelley, and he was talking about, the disappointment that they didn't cut rates this last time, and, they avoided the recession, and inflation looks good, and all that stuff, covering the usual suspects. What was really striking about it, if I had to pick one thing just to tell you guys about right now, was at the end of the interview, last minute or two, it was about 12, 13 minutes overall, Pelley asked Powell about the national debt, which, the national debt isn't monetary policy that goes under the Fed's purview. The national debt is fiscal policy because it has to do with budgets and Congress and stuff like that. So the Federal Reserve really doesn't technically have a role there. It may look like they do, but they don't really comment on it, and they don't, supposedly directly influence it. They just kind of end up, I think, on the back end of the equation when they monetize debt and all that kind of stuff, because we have unsustainable budget deficits and stuff like that. That's my understanding. But anyway, the point is that Powell actually answered the question about the national debt, even after noting that his role isn't to have anything to do with or comment on fiscal policy. And he flat out said that we're on an unsustainable path. We're on an unsustainable fiscal path. I mean, anybody halfway paying attention knows that. And surely Jerome Powell knows that. It's just he's really not technically supposed to say anything about it, and maybe it's not so technical. Maybe it's like he's not that he's not allowed to say it, but that they just steer clear of saying it under most circumstances. And this happened to not be that circumstance, because he actually responded to Scott Pelley about it. So that to me, when you have a Fed chairman in 2024 saying, I'm not supposed to comment on that, but yeah, we're on an unsustainable fiscal path, we should take notice of that. That's actually fairly significant. So that was the first thing, guys. Second thing was something that I tweeted out by a couple guys, like the original tweet, and then somebody reposted the tweet, and I retweeted that. But it was this really good chart, speaking of the national debt, that shows how, and I think this actually was something that Powell was referring to in the interview when he was talking about the unsustainability, and he said, we are on an unsustainable fiscal path. We are spending more than the economy is growing. And if you look at this chart that I tweeted out, guys, you'll see in the chart, it shows revenue versus debt. And it shows that the revenue was only growing at a certain rate, whatever the number was. And it shows that at a much higher clip, the debt is growing. So it shows these two lines. Well, it shows historically what's happened with the two of them. And of course, it shows, for example, during COVID, there was this massive spike in the debt, but only a little bit of an increase in the revenue that the United States took in. So it shows you that historically, and then it goes into a projected portion of the graph, and that's where the two lines just run away from each other. There's a steady glide path to the revenue, but there's a much steeper incline to the debt. And so it's this one chart, if you had to carry around with you one picture of how fucked we are, excuse my language, that's probably the one you would pull out, because it's simplistic, but it's impactful, it's compelling, and it kind of wraps together all these themes into, kind of one shot, for digesting it. And so that was kind of referred to. I mean, I actually just realized that while I was talking on this live. That was actually something Powell referred to in pretty much those terms. I mean, he said the debt is growing faster than the economy, i.e. revenue. So anyway, check that out, guys, if you haven't seen it already. It's on my Wealth for Real Twitter page. There's a bunch of other guys tweeting it, retweeting it, that are out there as well. But definitely, definitely a sight to behold when you really kind of digest it. The last thing I wanted to kind of point out, guys, before I run out of time here, I noticed a couple videos back. I did a Facebook Live where I talked about, I think it was on Thursday or Friday last week, 1st or 2nd of February. I talked about the bank stress going on with New York City Bancorp, and I think it's Azora. I definitely got that name wrong. It was the Japanese bank that was connected to New York City Bancorp, and I think it was Azora or Alzora, something like that. So I did a video about that, and it was one of the rare instances where one of my longer videos actually got over 100 views. I think it was like, last I checked, it was like 130 views. Peanuts by most standards, but for me, like a long video like that, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it was, that's actually quite a lot of views for it to get. But anyway, what I thought was interesting about it was that on that topic, there was a tweet that was quoting, it was an Unusual Whales tweet. I forget who it was quoting, but whoever it was quoting, whatever publication, sorry about the ambulance, guys, whoever or whatever it was quoting said, I think it was actually JP Morgan Chase or something, was saying that the amount of exposure to commercial real estate loans between small regional banks and like national banks like JP Morgan Chase, or maybe Bank of America, maybe, obviously be another one they'd be referring to. It was pretty drastic. Like the small regional banks had like 28%. I don't even know what the number was saying. Like maybe 28% of the assets on their balance sheet were commercial real estate loans. I think that's what it was. And then it was like 6.5% of national banks. And I was like, okay, and again, like this is the benefit of being like a little bit older and kind of living through some of this stuff before. I was like, this sounds familiar. This sounds like mid-2000s when a lot of people were saying, yeah, our subprime exposure is pretty low, or we don't do subprime or whatever, whatever the refrain was back then. And then, surprisingly, it turned out that it wasn't just how many subprime loans had you made. It was like, how many derivative investments did you, if you want to call them that, did you make in subprime, i.e. the credit default swap, right? Like, I know all the Gen Xers out there and otherwise who lived through and paid attention to the Great Recession. I mean, man, that brings back memories, doesn't it, guys? The CDS, the credit default swap. And here came another tsunami of losses, not from subprime loans, but from derivative bets made on subprime loans, right? That sort of like multiplied, and that's probably a kind word, multiplied the exposure to subprime throughout the system. And then, of course, the interconnectedness of the system became a problem. Of course, I made a video about that a couple videos back, I think also mid or late last week, about the precautionary principle and the Taleb paper and all that. So definitely, the interconnectedness is a huge deal here. But, this was the ignorance that existed in the system the last time when it was like being, something like this would be treated, this commercial real estate problem would be treated like subprime. Like, yeah, it's just, it's just a little sliver, a little sector, that's exposed to that. It's only up to this amount, so we can stress test it away. It's not gonna really hurt anybody when the crap hits the fan or whatever. So I couldn't help but think. I mean, I'm really glad the video has gotten some exposure, maybe for somebody who wasn't tracking those bank stress. I think I mentioned something about collapse. But the banks haven't collapsed yet. I think they may be like teetering on it or getting close to it, or they're on a pathway towards it. But it's really, really encouraging to see the video get some traction, because if you weren't aware of it, you're kind of starting to be like, okay, what was going on with these banks? What's the reason? One thing you definitely got to do is not just read the headline, not just be like, oh, like, the commercial real estate problem is very well contained okay, on to the next. Like, you got to think about it a little bit, because the last time we lived through this was now 16 years ago. That's kind of what we were told, that the whole thing was contained and it wasn't as bad as it looked and it wasn't as bad as it sounded and all that kind of stuff. And then the next thing you know, it spilled over from one thing to the next thing to the next thing and into utter collapse. And I think, bringing this full circle, guys, before I wrap it up, to the Powell interview, and I mean this as literally as I'm going to say it, and it's in some ways it's a great heuristic to kind of pay attention to, but I think it can be taken literally. And watching Powell in that interview, guys, all I could think of the whole time was, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what... Every time he made some kind of declaration, like we want to get inflation down to this and we have it at this, or we believe that we have gotten ourselves on the road to stamping out inflation, whatever he was saying, right? I just kept thinking to myself, you don't know what you're talking about, right? This is the expert problem that Nassim Taleb and others have talked about, that we see, in a suit, in a tie, dressed well, dressed professionally, male or female, on TV with a title, a really important title, saying stuff, and we're like, oh, yeah, they must know what's going on. I mean, this is what they do for a living, right? Like this guy runs the Fed for a living. He must know what he's talking about. And it's like, that's what we said about Bernanke, guys. That's what we said about Greenspan, guys. They didn't know what they were talking about. That was the revelation. They didn't know what they were talking about. Right? Bernanke came on TV in 05, 06, 07. Subprime, not a problem. Don't see a problem with the larger housing market. Don't see a problem in the economy or the stock market. And he was dead fucking wrong about all of it. Everything. He was wrong about everything. It's actually kind of safe to say that. Like, you know what I mean? Like normally you'd be like, oh, it's an exaggeration. It's too broad of a statement. It's actually kind of safe to say that he didn't know anything he was talking about. Didn't know anything about it. Okay? Got everything wrong. Everything. So when I look at Powell on that screen, I just kind of like mentally now, being 48 years old and living through some of this stuff already, I just watch the guy and I'm like, yep, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. You're saying that because you think, in the best scenario, maybe he knows otherwise, but in the best scenario, he thinks he knows, what this data means, and he's spent a lot of time looking at it and talking to other Fed chairmen about it. So this is a confident prediction. You know what I mean? Like that's at the best case. Okay. And so I think that's a rule of thumb that you guys will be well served to follow, is watch these so-called experts and then just say in your mind, like, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know. You don't know. You don't know. Last time they didn't know. The time before that they didn't know. The time before that they didn't know. They don't know. They never know. Okay? So, and I could get started on, the Powell talking about, I think he was asked about the politics of the whole thing at one point and taking that into account. And he was like, we have so many factors to take into account. There's no way we're going to take politics into account. I'm like, yeah, you're basically sitting there saying you have to look into a crystal ball, right? You're centrally planning the cost of money. And you're kind of saying that you have to look into a crystal ball and predict all these things. Like, you know what I mean? Like, why are we doing that? Why is that our system? Totally different video, guys. I'll get to that video another time. So anyway, thanks for watching this, guys. Hope everybody has a great Thursday night. And really appreciate you guys watching. Until next time, talk to you guys soon.